And joining us here today is Professor Andrew Tettenborn, lecturer in law at Swansea University. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So everyone seems to have been focused on the campaign in France recently, but the UK is equally interesting, one could say. So we have Rishi Sunak fighting a desperate battle. We have reform, which again, you have a certain character making very controversial statements and making his presence felt a few years after the Brexit debacle. Finally, we have prospective Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, who does not really come across as a candidate that's able to elicit any sort of passion from the voters. So what does it tell us about the condition of the political scene in the UK today?
Well, it's a very interesting election indeed, actually, because unlike many elections in Britain, and certainly very much unlike the last time that Labour achieved a landslide in 1997, this is very much an election where people are deciding who they dislike the least rather than those whom they like the most. The enormous lead of the Labour Party in the polls, which I think will almost certainly morph into a Labour government when the result is announced on Friday, the enormous lead of Labour in the polls, I think, is very much a statement that the country does not like the existing Conservative leadership. Why does it dislike it? I think the answer is not so much a matter of ideology. I think it's the fact that the British people dislike inefficiency, and that the feeling is the Conservative Party simply have been unable to govern effectively. There is no enormous desire for Labour. Nobody likes the Conservative Party, and I don't think anyone is particularly keen on the Liberal Democrats, who are our traditional third party.
Not to mention Nigel Farage, which is still so controversial as to be toxic.
I was coming to him in a moment.
Right.
The interesting thing about Nigel Farage is that he is the one person who does actually attract quite a lot of people who would otherwise have voted Conservative. And I think that may very well show up in a larger number of seats than people are predicting at the moment for Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage certainly has said things which are controversial and has been called out for it. Whether that will necessarily do him much harm in the polls is an open question. The point being that he has a very loyal fan base who are unlikely to be turned off by what he has said. And those who complain loudly, or most loudly, at what they have heard from Nigel Farage are people who would never dream of voting for him anyway. In that, there is clearly very much of a parallel between Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen. And I would suspect, actually, that the success of Rassemblement National in France, which we saw last night with Marine Le Pen on 34%, I think that success may encourage more people in Britain to vote for reform.
And now looking at the situation also on now different points that both Labour and Conservatives are making. Now we are talking about, of course, healthcare and immigration and crime, and immigration policies especially are a major point of contentions, at least from what I gather. So the Conservatives are advocating for a stricter immigration controls, while Labour promotes a more balanced approach, emphasising humane treatment and integration. So what are the potential impacts of their policies and differences between them?
Well, I think actually, if you look at their official policies on immigration, there isn't a great deal between them. I'm not saying you couldn't put what used to be called a cigarette paper between them, but there isn't a great deal. The argument essentially is how the country controls its immigration. Neither party is calling for elimination of immigration. I think both parties agree that immigration needs probably to be reduced, and in particular, illegal immigration needs to be reduced. What has happened is that we've had one matter which has split Britain top to bottom, and that, of course, is the scheme for processing would-be asylum seekers in Rwanda, in Africa, which the Labour Party has been solidly against, and the Conservative Party has been promoting, and which will be abandoned immediately if Labour gets into power. I think the feeling in Britain is, however, that Labour, while it says that it wants to reduce immigration, has less of a desire to do so, and that the deputies who are elected for Labour, the members of Parliament who are elected for Labour, may very well not have much of a stomach for limiting immigration. And again, the perception is that those who are elected in the Conservative, and certainly those who are elected in the Reform interest, will have much more stake in actually taking effective steps.
So just one very quick question, because we only have about half a minute left. Foreign policy, do you think that under Keir Starmer it is likely to change? Will Britain be, for example, less willing to help Ukraine, or are we staying on the same course?
Right. Two things on that. Ukraine, I suspect very little change. The one place where you might look for change, which may worry some people, is Israel, where there is very much more anti-Israeli feeling in the Labour Party than there is in the Conservative Party.
So we might be seeing a shift there. Still, before we actually announce the official results of the elections, we cannot make any sort of binding predictions in any way. For the time being, Professor Andrew Tettenborn was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.